Despite clamour for change, Sri Lanka's Ranil Wickremesinghe has been named the country's new president. The former six-time Prime Minister replaces Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who was forced out of office by protesters who blame him for the country's economic collapse. Parliament's move is likely to anger demonstrators who have been demanding for weeks now that Mr. Wickremesinghe step down.
Despair and disappointment as crowds of protesters watched Parliament elect Ranil Wickremesinghe as Sri Lanka's new leader. But defiant demonstrators say they aren't giving up.
We won't back down. We won't let this be. We won't settle for any less. Because at the same time, this is exactly what we're fighting for. And the people deserve to get their basic necessities. They deserve fuel. They deserve transportation. They deserve anything that these citizens of Sri Lanka needs.
He's someone who was rejected by the people's mandate, and then how ethical is it for someone like him, let alone lead a government, lead a country, be the head of a state?
Many Sri Lankans were hoping for a change in power and have said only a complete overhaul of the government would satisfy their demands. The former Prime Minister had failed in his previous 2 runs for the presidency. Mr. Wickremesinghe's appointment threatens to inflame unrest across the country, as many see him as a close ally of the Rajapaksa political dynasty. Elected with an overwhelming majority of 134 out of 219 votes, the new leader faces the mammoth task of pulling the country out of its worst economic crisis in decades.
මේ රට අද තියෙන්නේ ඔබතුමාට කියන්න උවමනා නැහැ කොච්චර අමාරු තත්ත්වයකද කියලා. ආර්ථික වශයෙන් රටේ තරුණ තරුණියන් ක්‍රමයේ වෙනසක් ඉල්ලනවා. අපිට විදේශ වශයෙන් අද ලෝකේ ප්‍රශ්න ගණනාවක් තියෙනට පැටලෙන්නේ නැතුව අපි යන්න තියෙන්නේ. ඉදිරියට යන්න අපි අලුත් වැඩසටහනක් ඇති කරන්න තියෙනවා. ජනතාව අපෙන් ඉල්ලන්නේ පරණ දේශපාලනේ නෙමෙයි. මේ පාර්ලිමේන්තුව එකට එකතු වෙලා ඒ වැඩ කටයුතු කරන එකයි.
He will be hoping to restore political stability so Sri Lanka can resume negotiations with the International Monetary Fund after talks stalled recently. The IMF says it will only work with the new government on a bailout package as long as Mr. Wickremesinghe has the support to lead the country.
And Prasad Karshala Dodangodaga, a senior journalist in Sri Lanka, joins us live. Mr. Prasad, widespread anger for weeks now over Mr. Wickremesinghe and now his appointment. What's the situation on the ground?
Yes, now the biggest challenge for him is the widespread anger from the general public, the protesters and large chunk of Sri Lankan public. Because when we consider protesters, their main main demand was removal of the president Gotabaya Rajapaksa, and their second demand was to remove Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe. Now that Prime Minister has become the 8th president of Sri Lanka with the vote held in Parliament today. So we saw in those reports that the view of the protesters, they are not going to back down, and at the same time, Mr. Wickremesinghe made his speech in Parliament, and he requested support from all political parties, the main opposition and the other Tamil political parties, Muslim political parties, from former Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa and the leftist JVP leader Anura Kumar Dissanayake. He requested all these politicians to extend support for him. But it will be a very difficult task because from the beginning, the vote in the parliament became a tug-of-war between the opposition parties and the SLPP, the party led by Mr. Rajapaksa, the Rajapaksas. Because the Rajapaksa's SLPP party had the 2/3 majority in this parliament. So once again, they have decided to extend their support to Mr. Wickremesinghe. So then it has become a tug-of-war between SLPP, the party which held the majority in the parliament, and the opposition parties. So once again, the view of the SLPP, the majority of the SLPP supported Mr. Rajapaksa, led by Rajapaksas, and they supported to Mr. Wickremesinghe. However, there are some contradictory reports because prior to this vote, SLPP, the leading party of the parliament, they mentioned that they are going to support Mr. Wickremesinghe. However, the other main contestant, Mr. Dallas Arhapperuma, he was also from a breakaway faction of SLPP. However, the majority of now, when we analyze this vote, majority of the SLPP MPs voted for Mr. Wickremesinghe. Then, after the vote, former Prime Minister, Mr. Mahinda Rajapaksa, he had a discussion with journalists. And at that discussion, he mentioned the SLPP voted for Mr. Dallas Alhapem, one of their members. So it's a bit contradictory because earlier SLPP was extending support, fully extending their support to Mr. Wickremesinghe. However, there was a contradiction and some controversy between the SLPP president and the general secretary.
Thank you so much indeed, Mr. Prasad.
There was some argument going on.
Yeah, for explaining the lack of unity even within what might imagine to be unity within the SLPP in the Sri Lankan parliament. Thanks so much for that. Prasad Kaushal Dodan Godaga, he's a senior journalist at Sri Lanka's national broadcaster.